Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Please, for all the listeners who haven't heard you before, could you introduce yourself again to everybody out there listening?
Thanks, Robbie, for having me back. So, my name is Mark Duffett. I'm an associate professor at the University of Chester, and I specialise in, well, popular music, fan culture, Elvis Presley, and associated topics.
Now, since you study Elvis, I got to ask, what do you think makes a cultural figure or just an icon?
An icon. Wow. I mean, that's such a huge question, isn't it? I mean, I suppose it, the ability to transcend stardom and become universal in some way would be one way to put it. I mean, you can go in two different directions with this question. One would be that it's about kind of religious association, and the other one would be that it's about some kind of level of giganticism. And I think I'd go for the second kind of element that, yeah, the appeal of Elvis and the myth and the story has kind of got to a very large level to the point where perhaps we project our own myths onto that, and maybe that's iconic. Um,
Can I ask from your perspective what Elvis would be? Like, who is Elvis if you were going to break it down for someone of maybe my generation that isn't kind of focused as much into the old, I wouldn't call it oldies. I mean, 10 years ago is technically oldies.
that makes me feel ancient. Okay, so Elvis was an unfeasibly prominent uh, singer who emerged through the rock and roll genre in the 1950s, rapidly became a global figure, and has remained in our memory ever since. And I think part of that is through representations on film, but certainly for people who know his music, it remains timeless. So although music fashions come and go, it seems like the music of Elvis has this amazing kind of timeless quality.
Now, do you think that the public, like let's say today's time, do you think the public remembers him for the things that I guess a lot of people appreciated him for, which was the music, which was the clothes, which was the style, which was, I mean, a ladies' man, if you want to say. But when you really boil down to things that I hear, it's like his favorite sandwich was a peanut butter, and then they just named something like that. I'm like, is that the only thing you give the guy credit for? I mean, the guy had some great songs and really impacted a lot of people's lives, my grandma being one of them.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, I'm glad your grandma's an Elvis fan.
I got all her records now, so that's why I was like, I gotta have Mark back on.
Yeah, yeah. If you want me to make record recommendations, I wrote a whole book on that. There we go, which is the one in the background here. Um, and yeah, I think we share the same favorite song, "If I Can Dream," which is kind of Elvis's song, isn't it? And it says a lot about his character and personality, I think. Um, what's the question again?
The remembrance of Elvis. It seems like a lot of people know the fun little details, but not necessarily who he was.
Yeah, okay, Robbie. I think of it like a kind of peeling an onion skin, and at one level, there's kind of stereotypes about Elvis that is in his iconicism. Like one of the qualities of an icon is you can reduce it to almost like the smallest bit, and it's still recognizably that thing or that person. And Elvis is not just an icon. In my view, he's an icon of individualism. I mean, he's the art. He's sort of like the ultimate individual, but at the same time, his individuality kind of resonates with a lot of social concerns and myths. In terms of that kind of question of remembrance, I think we'd have to ask the question, who's doing the remembering? Because I think maybe Elvis's fans and people who listen to his music a lot may be remembering differently to people who've kind of maybe gone to the cinema and see one or two Elvis films, or have some sort of casual relationship to Elvis movies, or saw the Baz Luhrmann film recently or anything like that. And not that I'm down on the Baz Luhrmann thing, I thought it was great in a lot of ways, but I think that maybe gives a particular view of Elvis, which sort of connects with some of his myth, but might not sort of be tied to the facts.
Now, how much is the myth different from reality?
Well, it depends which aspect of which myth you're talking about.
Did he work for the FBI? That's the main question. There's
Oh,
a
okay.
show
Because
that
yeah, I know
there,
you.
yeah, there's a show that came out on Netflix where he was a cartoon FBI secret agent. I know that's not real, but it's just interesting to see that like that's how we're representing this figure now is through a Netflix cartoon.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's a state and the overseers of his image kind of licensing it out to all sorts of different avenues, and you know, for a long time in popular culture, he's been kind of recycled for these different things. Um, I think if you're asking what, like, yeah, okay, so Elvis had a an interest in law enforcement. I don't think there's any secret in that. And he also collected police badges. And there's different sort of answers to the question of why he collected police badges. I think one of which might be that he could then kind of travel around with a firearm without anybody kind of worrying about it too
It's a
much.
good answer. You like to collect guns.
Yeah. So I think, but I mean, and also, of course, with that visit to Nixon, like he visited, yeah, what was it? The Bureau of no, he wanted the Bureau of Narcotics and to get a badge from those guys, didn't he? So that was the reason for his visit to Nixon, was to get another badge. Um, so yeah, I and I mean, if you're asking about his connection with the FBI, there's a huge FBI file on Elvis that you might know about that if you dig into has all sorts of stuff in it.
Now, was he a concern to the FBI? Was he just someone that was just of interest because he's a celebrity?
I think it was more the other way around that Elvis wanted the FBI to protect him in various ways. I mean, and in the 50s, um, there was an incident where I think it was somebody tried to blackmail Elvis. He had kind of big, if you look at the photos of him, you'll see this. He had quite big pores on his skin, on his cheeks, and he got a dermatologist to work with him. And the dermatologist, I think, tried to blackmail him. So the upshot of that was that the FBI kind of made a note of that. And then towards the end of his life, I think the those aeroplanes that he had, there was some kind of case where there was some shady dealings around those or some attempt at fraud or something. And that sort of takes up a whole load of the end of the FBI file. But yeah, it's something I've not dug into for a little while to kind of get the full details on.
Can I ask from when Elvis first became famous compared to where in your mind, through your research, you have seen a shift in his personality or just who he was as a, I mean, he guess you can call him an icon still even at the time because he kind of transcended into today's cultural icon symbol. But when did you see the real shift in him as a person, not necessarily his career?
What shift are you talking about, Rob? Are you talking about a kind of descent, or are you talking about I don't know, like a kind of recognition that he had an image, or what? Like what aspect there?
One, that he was going to be blackmailed by a dermatologist. That's I would put that on my chart of like, okay, life's a little bit different. I think I've reached a different echelon of fame there.
Oh, well, that I mean that happened multiple times in different ways, and I think one of the for me, like you going back to that question of iconicism, surely one of those moments. I mean, they happen right from the 50s. I mean, like the whole thing of kind of the restoration of his hometown in different ways in Tupelo and kind of the things that went on around Elvis culture there um, and were ongoing. I think that was one of the markers that this guy was kind of really big star and really important. And then into the early 70s, I think it was. The naming of the road that he lived on at Graceland as Elvis Presley Boulevard, that would surely be a kind of moment where you would recognize you were a bit of an icon at that moment if you're living on a road that's named after you. And I know at one point in the 70s, and I'd have to double check on the date for this one, I think maybe 73, 74, um, Elvis undertook or sort of delegated the undertaking of a microfilm cataloging of all his possessions. So he knew that he was kind of going to become part of history.
Did he develop a type of paranoia or anything?
Um,
I'm interested in like kind of the rabidness of fandom a little bit. It seems like there becomes like a disconnect in someone's what we would consider, I don't know, normal behavior compared to, oh my God, I'm standing in front of this person, I would kiss the ground they walk on. And I'm curious
Right.
if that, I mean, that has to do something not only to the celebrity, but also to the people around him.
Oh, I mean, uh, he lived with that for a long, long time. Insofar that if you think about it, right back in the mid 50s, and even before he hit national TV, he was generating a huge enthusiastic audience response at a regional and local level. So it wasn't like the excitement of fans around him, really. Where do you draw the line at the start of that? It's probably sort of 1954 when he's at the Overton Park Shell and he starts shaking his legs and the audience starts screaming. And then progressively on from that, there's sort of stories of his clothes getting torn off, right back in sort of maybe 55, 50, and certainly once he's on TV in 56, it's off the hook. Um so yeah, I think that I mean, I'm not sure that would lead you to paranoia, but it would certainly lead you to understand that you had that role, and then there would necessarily be a separation from yourself and that role. And I think that often repeated quote that he made in the 70s, where he kind of says, I'm in private, he says, I'm tired of being Elvis Presley. That, like, that whole thing of he knows that there's that press conference quote as well, like the image is one thing and the person is another. Right. So there was definitely a separation there between the private Elvis Presley and the public figure.
Was he affected at all by the counterculture movements or just anything that was going on more socially, movement wise?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the when we because Elvis has been so well preserved by history, and I think part of that is the impact that he had and the time that he came along. So he came along at the time where TV was being adopted as a mass domestic, appliance, and so we've got a good audio visual record of this guy and his talent. And if you look at performers before that, um, we might have some notion of their extreme popularity. I mean, like early Sinatra, Rudolph Valentino, or going back into the 19th century, Jenny Lind and people, but we don't have that sort of audio visual record like we do with Elvis. Um, so that maybe answers part of your question. So repeat the question and I'll hit it a bit harder.
The social movements, if you're
Oh
talking
yeah,
about
the
like,
counterculture.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think yeah. So what I was saying was that because we have this audio visual record, and because Elvis is in some way so timeless to us, we kind of think of him as out of time, but of course he wasn't. He was in time, and that in timeness is registered in all sorts of ways, even from things like Elvis walking off a plane and holding a copy of The Exorcist in the 70s, the novel. That was the thing you would read at the time when the film came out. So we know that he was in time, and equally he was in time with the counterculture. And although it didn't as much register in his films, although it did in some. I mean, there's a film called The Edge of Reality, where there's a kind of surreal psychedelic moment in it. Um, I think where the counterculture registered with Elvis, well, in multiple ways, really. I think the musicianship of the West Coast, the Wrecking Crew, and people like that, working on his records, but also um, his interest in New Age spirituality, which was really attributable to his hairdresser, Larry Geller, who kind of gave him copies of various kind of New Age books, and that sort of complicated his Christianity, shall we say.
can I ask what like an example of what we mean by New Age religion?
Oh yeah, okay. So in Christian religion, it's kind of monotheistic, and so you have God up above and you as being a child made by God, if you like, and there being questions around your repentance and your giving yourself to God and being born again. And in New Age spirituality, the idea is that God is a sort of actualizable potential within yourself. So it's kind of like a self-development religion around the idea of God being within. But of course, what New Age means kind of explodes out in all sorts of different directions. If God is within you, does that mean that we're all in a field of energy and that we're all kind of animistic spirits, or does it mean that we are all gods? Like what does it mean? Yeah, so it's a field of kind of religious discussion.
Did any of this impact his songs? Like, I mean, if we talk about like the 100 songs you wrote about, I mean, what obviously if you're developing, I mean, through some crazy times, your songs are going to develop with you. You're going to be singing about different things. They're going to have more of a, I mean, you look at John Lennon had different tone to his songs later on when more of the Vietnam War stuff was going on. So I'm curious if that you see a shift in his song works from, let's say, when he was really at stardom. Do you see any fans fall off? Do you see new audiences get attracted to him?
Yeah, you do at different times, and I think part of that is the movies and the kind of up and down with the movies at different points.
Which do you think impacted more, the movies or the music? I don't think I've seen an Elvis film.
Well, there's not a separation really, because like the movies were vehicles for the music, but also he was sort of continually releasing well, periodically releasing in the 60s, and his own releases were competing with his movie releases, which was a sort of industrial strategy for the Colonel, probably.
What do they say? The only enemy is myself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that really Elvis kind of suffered from that, and I think that was the commercial strategy of the Colonel was just keep him visible. And how do you keep him visible? Well, I have lots of releases, and then he's got a lot of releases, and then what happens? And this is also true in the 70s where you had these budget albums by Camden. Um, that Elvis gets lost amongst his different releases. So if he has a new release, it's got us sort of competing with these budget releases by him of old stuff. Um, yeah, so I think that's an issue in terms of it affecting his music. Um, yeah, okay. So Elvis is not a songwriter, so he's a chooser of songs. He's an interpreter of songs. People are writing songs for him. People are writing songs for like different parts of his movies. He's choosing songs in his live set and things like that. So we have to be a bit careful to say that there's sort of this sort of authorly sort of change. But yeah, for sure, Elvis's music in the 60s reflected the times. I mean, he covered the Beatles, he covered Odetta, and various other artists that were kind of connected to, maybe like covered Dylan. So there's certainly a reflection of the times. In terms of new age, I think Elvis is interested in the new age, and like he would give out a copy of a book called The Impersonal Life, which would be an example of this, and the idea that in our bodies we're kind of in a role, and perhaps our ego is maybe not as important. Um, the way that I would see that as impacting on Elvis is actually through things like karate. He's interested in the martial arts, which then he kind of demos on stage in about 74, in a big way. So he was always kind of connected with karate. And if you think about karate, all this like stuff about the Eastern philosophy about the movement of energy, yeah, that's kind of new age, really.
Yeah.
Um,
I never made that connection with it. I thought he just did it because it looked cool.
Well, it looked cool as well. I mean, it was a way to have. I mean, Elvis is a consummate entertainer, and he's always goofing about, isn't it? So it's a way to entertain his audiences as well, and kind of mystically kind of imply that there was, this is. I think one of the things of my research, looking at the discussions of Elvis and his fans, has always been this idea that, in a way, because Elvis is so popular, when somebody is like that and they seem welcoming, they sort of take on the power of their audience. So if they have a huge, huge audience, they become not exactly formidable figures, but sort of they have a high social status and they have this sort of empowerment. And yeah, that's part of why fans connect with them. And then I mean, I've theorized this using Durkheim's work, which we could sort of talk about, but I mean, it's kind of obvious, really. When somebody is very popular, we kind of know that when we meet them, and then we get a little bit anxious perhaps about meeting them because it's both exciting and anxiety provoking to think that they might not accept us. But of course, in Elvis's case, he's continually disarming that in his humbleness and his background, and he's saying things like, if you think I'm nervous, I am. Um, so there's a sort of nobody really gets the impression that Elvis would be snooty or turn them away, and that's kind of a huge part of his appeal. I think that he was deferential, he was humble, he was genuine, and he was also contradictory. So that's a sort of that also allows all sides in, doesn't it, on this equation?
When you say contradictory, do you mean like just he never really showed the fact that he was kind of nervous at times, or if he was more some of the things you used as examples for being humble, talking in interviews or things that he said publicly in interviews? He didn't show that on stage. I mean, for me, watching this is like the first time I've ever really seen anybody show so much energy. Like when you really focus on in the moment, that's Elvis. It's not, there's people that sing and dance and they're in the thing, but he was moving around on stage. He was actually there. He wasn't like, I just got to get through this gig and get over with, and then I get to go back to my hotel room.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's the energy he puts out on stage is genuine in that respect. And by the time he does something like the comeback special, even though that he hasn't really done live stuff for quite a while, he's got that knowledge and experience there of how to kind of mobilize an audience for sure. And so he's kind of a vessel for that, isn't he? He moves that energy through himself. I mean, that's one way to see it. Um, so yeah, I think that like he's an experienced entertainer in that respect, and probably the most experienced entertainer. Probably, I mean, in terms of, I mean, one of the words that he used discussing this in the early 70s when he was interviewed by a couple of guys that made a documentary about him was body vibrations, which is a really interesting term when you think about it. The whole moving to the movement or the moving to the music, kind of shaking your leg and kind of yeah, that has for a lot of fans that was kind of an erotic experience, right? And it was also a way to sort of yeah, use the music.
Well, shake the
Yeah.
shackles of repression too. I mean, I'm not using it in a sense that everybody was being like bricks were thrown at them, but there was a large amount of how you had to act in public, orderly. We still have that today. It's not, you can't just, I mean, some people like to break into dance into Walmart, but when you're at a show and somebody's singing and moving their legs and moving in a way that a lot of people, they might do in private, but never in public. I mean, it's intoxicating.
Yeah, and I think we have that narrative, don't we, that rock and roll was allowed people that kind of license to move their bodies, and that was linked in the 50s to the idea that, oh, this is kind of the end of sexual repression, and this is Elvis the pelvis, and this is kind of dangerous, and the young women of America better watch out. And I think that philosophy stayed through the counterculture and into the permissive society in the 70s. The idea that um, sexuality and sexual expression is kind of honesty, and that civilization is a sort of repressing force on that honesty, and it's kind of a Freudian idea, really. And Elvis kind of benefited from that idea in a sense. But yeah, I mean, he kind of marks the place where things go up tempo like that and happen. And yeah, he's. I often think of him like you're asking me about earlier. We were talking about what I thought of him, and I think he's a bridge figure between the like the vernacular musics of America, blues, soul, R&B, gospel, country, and the modern world. And to see him, we've got a popular music landscape now where this idea of the diva is important, and the diva is somebody of a marginalized identity kind of coming into the fold. And in a sense, Elvis was that in his day. He was the kind of he's southerner, he's kind of working class, and so he was able to bridge things, and I think Hollywood kind of used that to its advantage, but it was already there, I think, in a lot of ways in the music he did. But in the 50s that generated you know um controversy and opposition.
Do you think Hollywood was the biggest kind of detractor in his career? Or do you think that there was another factor that kind of, I wouldn't say hurt his career, but put it into, I don't know, maybe a bump in the road. Let's say that. It's a safe word.
Um, I think,
Because he obviously had a great career. I can't say that, his career went downhill or anything, but
well, his career was kind of a roller coaster. It's kind of up and down and roundabout. And I think when we look back on it, because we consider him an icon, we kind of focus on the triumphs. So we say, oh, there was the Aloha concert where he was broadcast in front of the world. There was the comeback special where he conquered TV again. There was the original performances on TV. And what we forget is all the kind of times in between or times where things might have gone wrong in various ways or were going wrong. Um, so at the end of his life, I mean, he was touring secondary markets in America. So I've got a ticket somewhere. I've got it on my desk actually. Um, oh, is that another one? Oh no, yeah, there you go. I don't know if you can probably can't see this.
I can
This
see
is a
that.
ticket. Elvis in concert in Hollywood, but it's Hollywood, Florida. So he's kind of going to sort of smaller and smaller places and traveling around, and the Colonel is selling out these places. So he's picking auditoriums where he can, what the Colonel would do would be to contact the local newspapers. The local newspapers would make a story out of it and say Elvis is coming to town, and the Colonel would peg all the tickets really cheap, so the auditorium would fill up. But then also Elvis would kind of turn up with like 100 members of like entourage, and so in economic terms it wasn't ideal. But so this is, when you think of the triumphs of his career, like being on TV in front of the world a few years earlier, this is quite a nosedive. And then if you add to that the moments where maybe Elvis's prescription drug intake caused him to forget, the word to songs or have problems on stage. I mean, some of the very late performances, although he is hitting the mark generally, there's really rare occasions where you kind of look at him and you think, my goodness, for this split second, there's almost no connection with the audience. And then you think he's alone on stage. And then you think, wow, if he's alone on stage at that moment, my goodness, over those previous over 20 years, he wasn't. And he could bring that audience organically to him. So yeah, I think there's moments where those moments of failure are actually moments where you kind of realize, the intense success in a way of what he did.
Do you think he was
Sounds
just
a bit weird, doesn't it?
well, do you think he was just overworked? I mean, I heard a story about his like behind the scenes on one of those Christmas specials where he did like a bunch of hours in a row or did like a flight or something like that and arrived. I mean, you could probably explain it better than I can, but it made it seem like, you know, the pill stuff, all this, the food stuff, everything that happens where kind of gets remembered by people. Everyone always says, "Oh, he died on the toilet." I was like, the guy was working probably more than a lot of us know when it comes to just being pressured for gigs and shows. And I mean, if you mentioned the Colonel selling out, you know, tickets at a lower price or doing something of that sort, I mean, maybe the peaks in his career and the drop-offs were because of the fact he was so available. I mean, sad to say it, Aerosmith was coming down to my town and they had to cancel, I think, the week before it happened. It was like they have never really been here. And they're like, okay, we'll be back in 2030. I was like, I don't think any of you guys, I mean, God forbid, knock on wood, but I don't know. You guys are getting up there in age. I mean, somebody's going to break a hip at some point.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways the lifestyle that Elvis led, staying up at night and taking these pills, in a way, he kind of he did live fast, didn't he? So maybe 40 or 42 for Elvis is might be like 60 or older
Damn,
for
I'm halfway there, man. I'm telling you.
Tell me about it. I'm over 50 now, so I shouldn't, complain. But in terms of this question of overwork, okay. Yes. I think Elvis loved what he did, but I think he was also nervous. And I think you need those nerves in a way to genuinely connect with an audience on stage. You come onto stage really blasé, you're not necessarily going to connect with them. So Elvis definitely had that kind of up and down thing in his performances, which many performers have, where like you're anxious about it before you do it, and it's a bit of an event when you do it, and then when you finish it, you're kind of relieved, and so that doesn't help. And then if you add in the touring, yeah, of course. So um, in terms of overwork, he definitely collapsed at least once in the 50s, and I think more than once in the 70s through overwork, through exhaustion. So evidently he was. And I can tell you this, one of the things I found out by doing the Counting Down Elvis book was that Chips Moman, the guy who produced Elvis when he did his American Sound sessions, also collapsed through overwork when he was mixing those records. So there was intense level of hard work that people were putting in. And then in the studio, Elvis was known to kind of do as many takes of a song as he wanted to get it right. And so, there were some songs where he was doing like, 30 takes or whatever to he's perfectionist. So in that respect, of course, that would take up time and resources, and this might be going through the night. And yeah, so combination of things. But yeah, I think he did work very hard at certain times. And perhaps maybe in the 60s was actually less hard work in a weird way, because although he was doing the films, he was doing maybe 3 films a year, and then like each of them would take a few weeks to film. So the rest of the year he could go back to Graceland or wherever, or live in Palm Springs and kind of have time off. So actually, the probably the 50s and the 70s were actually kind of much more exhausting times.
Might be a weird question, but do you think Graceland was a positive for Elvis?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yeah. What? Okay, so like going into this question of, like, you were talking about this question of fans before. I mean, we know by the time Elvis moved to Graceland, he already was a big star and he had a lot of fans after him. And so one of the first things he did at Graceland was fit the music gates where he knew that fans would come and hang out. So in that respect, he was already at that level. But um I think we generally see Graceland as sort of a version of Elvis's autobiography. It's the place where he can creatively be himself. But yeah, why? And also he gets to play there, right? Elvis is goofing around with his guys or holding a party or whatever. So in that respect, I guess it was good for Elvis. But why would it not be good for him?
Asking me now?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I am. I'm throwing it back to you so I can figure out why
I
where you're
like
coming from.
work. I like my days off, but you put me like in the lockdown situation almost however long inside my own house, you start to go a little bit crazy. And if you talk about around the 60s when he's more prominent at Graceland, I start to ask, I mean, is it too much of a good thing? Not to add a little Elvis on that end of that there, but too much of a good thing can sometimes be a bad thing.
Yeah, well, I guess I remember there was a book about around Elvis when he died, and one of the phrases that came out of it, I think it was Serge Denisov's book, was the prisoner in the mansion hypothesis, which I think that sort of sums up Graceland, doesn't it? The idea that Elvis is in sort of this captivity almost, and he has privacy upstairs at Graceland, but Graceland is a communal place in a lot of ways. Guys are coming round. I think didn't Charlie? I think had some living quarters in there. I think Jerry Schilling was possibly living there for a while, and
Charlie who?
so Charlie Hodge, yeah, Charlie Hodge was a guy who was on stage with Elvis, and was yeah, he's kind of aide. Met him in the army, yeah, because this is the other thing, that there's probably a big who's who of Elvis people that we have to.
I have
Kind
a album with him wearing an army uniform on the front cover. He's got his face.
okay,
I think it's an army
that
uniform. Yeah.
could be the cover of Big Hunk of Love as a single. I think he did for that. I
He
think that
looks
was in,
young, very young.
yeah, that would be the late 50s. Um, yeah, so I think. I think, I mean, I what I think is interesting about Graceland is, in a sense, although Elvis has privacy upstairs at Graceland, he's kind of pretty much always on show in different ways, isn't he? I mean, like, a lot of the people that hung out at the Graceland gate, some of the more dedicated ones, they were called gate people, and they would be regulars, just hanging out there waiting for Elvis. And they often met at a little restaurant called the Hickory Log and would kind of exchange information on where Elvis was, whether he was in town, out of town. And then a lot of those fans have took pictures of him coming in and out of the gate in his car. So we have this sort of record of what Elvis was wearing, and the fans have become like historians. Um, but I think in a way, as soon as he probably got out of the upstairs of Graceland and certainly out of the house and in the grounds, he's kind of on display in different ways. And this question of what does privacy mean, I think, is a tricky one for a figure like Elvis, because, well, people are going to write stuff about him at the time or after he goes or whatever. I mean, going back to this question of stress and decline, clearly the Bodyguard book, Elvis, What Happened, which came out a bit before he died, was a stressful event, I think, for Elvis. And he described it to one person as gossip put out as a book. But having that sort of life of scandal, as well as everything else, is going to add to your stress levels.
Do you think that he knew what his identity was? I mean, I wouldn't say going through imposter syndrome, but if everyone knows you as Elvis, I mean, are you safe to do that inside of your own home? And then what does Elvis even mean? You know what I mean? Like, doesn't Elvis on stage dancing and doing all this, making amazing music, and then you take a period of time off before you go back out? I mean, that craving to go back out, not just because you want the stage and you love being out there singing music, but it's also, where's Elvis? Am I Elvis still? Do I still have it? These questions start to come up. And that might be my own speculation, but I'm just looking at it from examining it from a celebrity standpoint. I'm not a celebrity, but I've definitely looked into a little bit about what that fame can do to a person.
Yeah, I mean, one of the sources on Elvis that I trust implicitly is Billy Smith's YouTube channel, because Billy Smith was one of Elvis's relatives, and he was kind of close to Elvis a lot of the time. And I don't think he has the same kind of commercial axe to grind, if you like, as some other Elvis sort of writers and people. And he has a lot of accounts of kind of being with Elvis in different times, and I think it's clear from those accounts and other places that Elvis kind of knew what his image was, and he knew what his identity was. But when you look at what Elvis was interested in and what he did, I think, I mean, one of the things, that going back to this sort of idea of the peeling the onion skin, if you like, away from the stereotypes of Elvis, one of the stereotypes of Elvis is just a dumb southerner. But when you look at it, one of the things that Elvis did a lot in his private life was read. And his reading material was diverse. And his interests, were diverse in that respect. And things like his interest in New Age religion, I mean, that runs almost completely counter in a way to his public identity at that point when he's doing those movies in the 60s. So I think he found ways to sort of preserve his private self. Um, but
You
yeah,
said
he
it,
would have
you said it
gone.
runs counter to his public perception or how people viewed him. But what about if I Can Dream? That song is way too. I think it means more. Like, I'm not. I think it sounds like Elvis. It's not like, I mean, I'm not saying Elvis is a bad singer. It sounds like he could just talk it and it's coming out. But it's the emotion that he had when he sang it. I don't sense fakeness. I sense authenticity. I mean, that's why I think I like it so much.
I'd agree, and I think Elvis's music is authentic to feelings, and it's very difficult to analyze music because there's chords and notes and what musicians do, but there is that question of how you kind of get to that kind of soul in music. And when you listen to Elvis's voice, quite often there's multiple emotions at once stacked together in the way that he conveys things. Um, but I think the movies, the inclusion of Elvis in different plot lines, like Harem Scarum, a movie for kids, or Charo, where Elvis is a sort of a greeting card cowboy type figure. Um, they're kind of different to the person that Elvis actually was.
You're gonna have to write down some of these movies for me so I can start doing a little
Yeah,
deep
yeah, yeah.
dive on them.
I'll send you a list. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I want to ask, when it comes to the record, what do you trust as sources to look at, and why are there so many independent theories or runoffs if there's such a complete record of Elvis?
That's a good question, and I think it can be very hard to trust. I mean, I think most.
Despite my JFK research, I'm pretty fact oriented. I'm digging through a lot of documentation for a lot of stuff and speaking to individuals who are actually there, which I've done multiple times. But
I think that's a good thing to do if you can, but of course, a lot of the individuals around Elvis are dying out, and they're quite hard to get to. But many of them have written books. Many of those books do have commercial impulses behind them. So you have to read them from the point of view of, well, is this being given to us to set the record straight, or is this some kind of spin on this information? But the thing with Elvis, he's such a public figure that like there's multiple places where the same story is told. So you can kind of check it up on a little different places, including, memoirs from fans and people like that that were just around, maybe when he went to the Memphian sort of theatre to watch a film or whatever at night, or other things. So in terms of what I trust, I think as you keep digging in this world, I mean, this is probably same as JFK. You come across authors and sources that just seem like they've really done their homework from what you already know, and you think about their quality and their reputation and whether they would have any kind of commercial motive and what that would be. And then you just kind of sit down and think, okay, there are certain things within the Elvis community that people will point to and go, okay, so this is probably a trustworthy source. So Keith Flynn, for example, has spent a long time doing a website that has a lot of Elvis's recording sessions on it and things like that. And that's trusted to the point that people like Peter Gralnick will go to it and look at it, I believe. So I think Peter Gralnick's work is very much trusted, I think, within the Elvis fan community. So it is a case of finding things that like seem to have a seal of quality on, where maybe people you kind of trust the digging that people have done. Um, but yeah, I mean, there have been some heinous like fakes in the Elvis world. There's a lot of kind of, well, as you kind of know, in the modern universe of kind of Amazon Kindle publishing and AI publishing, there's a lot of low grade information out there on different
you don't
things.
think he's still alive?
Exactly. But I mean, the amount of what boggles me is sometimes the amount of time that people will put into kind of, researching and writing about Elvis. I've got one book called The Elvis Encyclopedia by Adam Victor, and it's got in the front, this took Adam Victor six years to do, and you're reading it, and it's, massive book, small print, and I think 6 years, he did it quickly. This is such a massive universe of facts he's corralling here. And as I'm reading that, I'm thinking, oh, he's putting things in here that I probably wouldn't. Like there's a bit where he mentions that he thinks that William Faulkner wrote to Elvis after Elvis's mother died. I've never seen that corroborated anywhere else, so I don't know if that's true. So I think you get to a point where you check different sources against each other. You come to trust some sources more than others, and yeah, I think that's generally how it works.
I've been in the research a little bit, despite I know the topic I'm technically interested in is a bit more controversial when it comes to everyone rolling their eyes at it pretty quickly. But I think research based, I go by documentation, I go by what I can prove. I only try and talk about what I verifiably have read. It gets difficult because obviously independent theories from individual people start running off and stuff where there is no evidence for. And at that point, when you can't explain that, I mean, I don't know, would you say it impacts your, not personality, but impacts your, I don't know, potential for understanding Elvis? Like, how would you explain all the individual theories to someone who's new to Elvis? I'm new to Elvis.
I'd probably chuck a book like Elvis for Dummies by Susan Doll at them because I know that she's done a certain amount of homework. So or I'd chuck one of my books at them. In fact, even better, I'd chuck this one, which was I don't know if you could see this one,
Good
but
old
that
Richard Nixon. That's the
it
one I
came
found
about.
you on.
Yeah, yeah. Elvis Roots Image Comeback Phenomena, which is action packed, and I can send you an ebook of it, and that's got loads of stuff that I dug up. Um, but yeah, I think you just get to kind of go, right, this looks interesting. But like I said, there have been whole books where there's been loads of stuff faked. There was one that's like, you think, oh, this is the text of sort of 50s recording and stuff like that. And you look like it gets reviewed in Elvis World and they say, oh no, this is actually, he didn't know all this stuff. He just made it up. Oh, no. So I think the more you do it, the more you kind of dig in and dive in. There's very little academic work on Elvis, and there's a few colleagues in history and places that are starting to do books on Elvis. So I think I trust what they do. Um, so yeah,
Why
it's an emergent.
academics so little? Why is that so little with Elvis?
Good question. I think
There's some on JFK I'm happy about, and
yeah.
rightfully they're swinging from my side too, some of them.
You you've got quite a stream of JFK academics
I'll
on
answer
your.
any question you want, my friend. Just don't call me a conspiracy theorist. I can't handle that shit.
Yeah. Well, I think okay, so popular music studies as it developed um, came about in the wake of the Beatles, actually. And the Beatles always had a bit more of a sort of middle class cultural cachet than Elvis. And one thing I did a while back was look through the archive of the journal Cahiers de Cinema, which was the journal that kind of birthed the French New Wave kind of film movement. And there's hardly anything written about Elvis films in there. But whenever the Beatles bring out a film, there's a fair bit written. And I think the Beatles, um, through things like artistic collaboration, connections with things like jazz and other means, kind of elevated themselves, if you like. Um, so yeah, I mean, the short answer would be that sort of because academics were more interested in the Beatles than Elvis
Don't
because
say that. A friend of ours is going to be clapping his hands right now that you just said that.
I know he is, I know. And hello, Richard, if you're out there. But we all know that Elvis is better than the Beatles, and there's nothing to say on that. If after all, there was four Beatles and one Elvis. But
I've
um,
changed my opinion. I used to say the Beatles are kind of, I just because I knew them more for my age. I mean, my grandparents listened to the Beatles and I would go up to their house all the time. But then when I got my grandmom, when she passed away and I got her records, I got nothing but Elvis, Sinatra. I liked all that stuff before, but I never really could appreciate it until I could sit down and actually kick back, look up at the ceiling and blast some of these things.
I should postscript that with I was completely joking about it was the Beatles. Like, there's loads of crossover, and we know that they covered each other, and that whole sort of I believe there was a deleted scene in Pulp Fiction where there was a discussion about, either you're a Beatles person or an Elvis person, and it says a lot about you. I I don't really work like that. I just think, that they're both really interesting acts, and yeah, there's a lot. And I do work on Beatlemania as well as Elvis fandom, and I think there's lots of interesting things to say.
But Elvis above the board, right?
I
Oh,
mean,
come
I
on.
I I originally got into Elvis because I was studying fandom, and I thought, who's got loads of loyal and prominent fans? It's Elvis. So my
Gene
route.
Simmons. Sorry.
Well, there's another whole podcast to do on Kiss, isn't there? I think you need to do a Kiss podcast.
I'm good. My dad was in a cover band for 40 years on Kiss. I don't need to be. He's in a commercial with them, so
That's amazing.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
He did not
They've
like
just
Gene Simmons, sadly.
they've just sort of done their last gig, haven't they? Is that gone off yet? And they're turning into avatars, I believe, and sort of immortalizing themselves in digital form.
Ah.
I mean, that's an interesting thing because in a way, Kiss, I often think about this. They're really kind of, at least in their more recent years, incarnation, a business that happens to be a band, aren't they? Would that be fair to say? I don't know. It's an opinion,
There's
but
a point when the fame doesn't go away or you don't want it to go away and you just start kind of milking it. I mean, when you start producing TV shows that aren't yet necessarily even about music or about any plot line, like not different from a movie, it's just about Gene Simmons and his family life and it's like reality television.
my partner's never forgiven me for watching Kiss Meets Scooby Doo as part
Damn,
of my
really? I like that a lot.
yeah. You should watch it. It's good if you've not seen it. It's fun.
That and Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park is probably like one of my like the two favorites up there.
Yeah, I like the concept of Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, but having watched it, I was kind of a bit disappointed. But I like the idea of like Kiss and Phantom of the Opera because, of course, Paul Stanley, I think, played in the Phantom of the Opera for a while on stage. So there's evidently a connection there. I think it's the makeup thing. But I mean that when you think about Elvis, like go back to Elvis, um, that question of business and talent is always coming up, isn't it? The idea that he was just kind of this exploited commodity rather than somebody given free rein to fully express his talent. And I think there is some truth in it that he had a manager that was, that his first concern was making money out of whatever they were doing. So
There's gonna be a two-part probably answer from you, but who do you think keeps the image of Elvis alive? The one that you would like to remember, or compared to the one that is getting remembered? They're not the same, in my opinion.
what do I think keeps the image of Elvis alive?
I think it's the
Um,
commercialization.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, how often do you turn on the radio and hear an Elvis song? Not that often, really. So what is going on is that Elvis's um, estate and the commercial entity that oversees his public image is forwarding sort of portrayals and portraits of Elvis through cinema, which was, after all, what kind of kept Elvis alive in the 60s, if you think about it. They're still doing that now. Um, when you think about it, even if you go back to the 50s, Elvis in cinema was what got Elvis all over the world. I mean, it was harder to hear Elvis's music on the radio. There were certain pirate radio underground stations or, Radio Luxembourg or whoever playing it in the UK. But when Elvis films came along, like Jailhouse Rock and King Creole, it was like, oh, this is the guy, and this is what he does, and this is his performance style, and this is what he looks like. And then that carried on, into the 60s, that those fans who'd been um, turned on by that then still got that image in various, like a steady stream of cinematic releases, and that's what's still going on. Only the cinematic releases that are going on now are more diverse. So Baz Luhrmann's film was kind of, generally speaking, respectful, although people might dispute me on that, but it certainly got across notions of Elvis's charm, skill, and creativity. I think. I mean, that scene where Austin Butler as Elvis is kind of working up the band in Las Vegas to kind of perform the songs, I think demonstrates kind of Elvis's musical talents. Um, so there's that kind of representation, and then there's the recent one, which I've not actually seen yet, so I can't really comment on, by Sofia Coppola, which is sort of done less well at the box office, but is a different view of Elvis. And then there was the film Elvis and Nixon with Michael Shannon, which is a completely different view of Elvis. So, and then there's the Agent Elvis cartoon. So there's lots of cinematic versionings of Elvis that are coming out that kind of taking the image and the idea of him in different directions. And I think what he means to a lot of people is kind of ambiguously somewhere between all these different representations, isn't it?
Do you think he broke the border of being a musician to an actor and to a karate person, or do you think that he somehow kind of still stayed in the musician? I think most people probably know him from, I know you mentioned his movies, but to be honest, I mean, I think a lot of kids my age know him just from the music.
Yeah, and it depends. It depends maybe what generation you are and what you've been exposed to and what you see. And I think, in Britain we have quite a lot of TV reruns of things like the Comeback Special and the Aloha concert. So I think people are familiar with Elvis's music. Um, so it yeah, it depends. Yeah, what you've been exposed to, I think.
I'll ask you, what's one interesting thing about Elvis that you found out? It could be shocking too. And then I'm gonna ask you when it comes to the newer generations, my generation, younger generations, why people should get interested in looking into Elvis, not only his life and his music and his movies, but something personal from you that you found would be, I mean, it's kind of like the same question, so I wouldn't even call it a two-parter.
What have I found interesting about Elvis that I didn't know before? I'm constantly finding things that find interesting about Elvis
Did he wear
that
a
I did.
wig?
Sorry?
Did he wear a wig?
Did he wear a wig? Not that I know of.
Damn, he's got some great hair. I'm trying to
Yeah,
look
yeah,
for it right now.
yeah. Of course, he used to dye his hair. You probably know that. And
I would hope
yeah.
so because that's very jet black, and if somebody has that naturally, that's a problem.
Oh, I know something that might interest you, Robbie. Elvis was Jewish. So there you
Okay.
go. There's something
Oh,
that not many people talk about or know. So that's maybe an example of
it's a win
something
for
that,
my team.
yeah.
I'm like a small percentage Ashkenazi. I don't even really, I guess, qualify. But yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that. That's weird though with the religion thing then.
Yeah. I believe he was Jewish on his mother's side, and that that wasn't made a prominent part of his representation or discussed very much. But I think
I'm
he used to
guessing
wear a
because
Star of David sometimes. Yeah.
Kiss used to, it was very a taboo thing for like these guys who were Jewish to dress up and wear whatever outfits and costumes and makeups and things of that sort and go on stage. And I mean, it was rock and roll too. It was kind of seemed demonic more. But that was a thing with them too, which was interesting, was that these guys could get up on stage and really have this impact in such a way that was, I don't know, guess different for the, maybe it's a different time. I mean, I think everything's accepted at this point now.
Yeah, I think so. I think we we'd have to look at the prevalence of anti-Semitism at different points to sort of see what how that worked out. But yeah, I think it's kind of within the Elvis community of people who kind of read up on Elvis. It's kind of well known that he was Jewish, so that's something that not many people kind of know or think about. Yeah, I mean, I just I'm just there for anything like
Yeah.
what movies he watched or what books he read or things like that. That's sort of stuff that fascinates me.
Did he ever reach Catcher in the Rye?
Oh, oh no, I'd have to look that one up. I don't know, but I know that you've had some discussions over Mark Chapman's death and that
Well,
the
Mark Chapman's
prevalence.
still alive. It's John Lennon's death.
Oh, sorry, yeah, blimey, my head's cabbage, isn't it? You're right. Yeah, um, yeah.
Did
I
I
mean,
have
Catcher.
parole for the 14th time? I've never heard that in my entire life.
Yeah, I mean, I don't reckon he's ever going to get out, is he, by the sound of it? But very sad situation all round. Um, yeah, I don't know whether Elvis read Catcher in the Rye. That's a good question. I'd have to sort of do some digging on that.
It's not even with Mark Chapman relation. It's just I know it was a popular book of the times back then. I don't know. I didn't find it very interesting at all to read, but apparently it caught something in the culture.
Yeah, I believe so. Have you ever read it? So you've read it. Yeah, I've never
About
actually read it.
about
So
like maybe halfway through it, and I just decided I don't think this is getting any better. So let me put that sucker down.
kind of cynical tone, and that it's. I think it has a connection with Taxi Driver, Catcher in the Rye as well. That might be something to dig into.
The movie or the
Yeah, I think so. I
well,
might
I
be
gotta
getting my
watch
thoughts.
Taxi Driver.
Well, maybe that's maybe I've invented it. Um, yeah.
But what's one thing for you that you would recommend to people if they're going to look into Elvis?
Well, you mean if they're just sort of starting the trail and
Well,
like
obviously, I reached out and decided to have a podcast with you, and that's where my interest kind of sparked up a little bit.
yeah, well, I mean, I guess the first thing you probably should to do if you're on this trail is read Peter Grounick's two biographies of Elvis, Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love, because I think those would be a good education in the story. And then, you could branch out from there depending on what you're interested in. If you want something um, encyclopedic, then yeah, that Elvis Encyclopedia by Adam Victor is one I recommend. I also recommend my own books, of course.
Of course.
And yeah, I'm always finding new Elvis books. That's the other thing that like with Elvis and the Beatles, and there's a continual growth in the library. And it's got to a forensic stage where people will do a whole book on Beatlemania in Chicago, or Elvis in Texas, or whatever. And I love that, that there's this sort of hyper focus now of people researching these different things.
I will ask this last thing, I can edit it out, but would you be turned off or maybe away from, like call it more conspiracy, if you think that it was more than Mark Chapman?
um sorry, would I be turned off
Because
the
David Whelan I've had on the show, and
Yeah, I heard his stuff. Yeah, I actually did a chapter on Mark Chapman. I've written a couple of things on Mark Chapman, and I did a chapter on Mark Chapman and the death of John Lennon, and more from the point of view. I mean, really, although I try and write about the facts if I'm given a book on Elvis to do like the one I did, but I am probably more interested in the way that popular culture creates myths and what those myths are connected with and what they mean. And I think the thing with Mark Chapman, I'm not a big enough expert on all of the different angles of second shooter or whatever, the different bullets and all of that digging stuff. So I can't comment on Whelan's book in that respect. But I think let's just if Chapman did it, let's take this the idea that he did do it, because I think most people would say that he did. Mental illness does not have a motive, and I think one of the issues that I kind of realized was that um, if somebody's mentally struggling, if they do something, there's not necessarily a rationalizable motive for what they've done. And I think as a culture, we want those motivations. We want to be able to point and go, they did it for this. So all the discussion about Mark Chapman and kind of getting his own fame, like it's like that film The Shootist, where you would shoot somebody as a trophy and get your own fame. I really question that, because I just think that really what Mark Chapman probably did was kind of latch on to those explanations that were already out there to kind of justify or kind of explain what he did. And I think that is questionable to me. I think if somebody's mentally struggling, mentally ill, challenged in a deep way, and they do something that we would perceive as bizarre or evil, there's no real explanation for it. And that was one thing I learned thinking about it, that actually, some things don't have a motivation, they don't have an explanation.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think even I think it's the reason he always changes his every parole hearing. It's a different thing. He was first it was possessed by demons, and well, originally they said they did it for fame. Then it was the Catcher in the Rye. Then it was possessed by demons, and then it was Catcher in the Rye. Then it was fame again. Then he doesn't know why he did it. Then he said he didn't do it. On all these different like hearings that would keep popping up, and what the best explanation I've heard has been that everyone that goes in there to defend him or when he's going up for parole says he'll do anything to get out, basically. And this person says, say this and we'll get you out. And that's why he keeps changing his statements. I don't know if he seems pretty clear if you listen to some of his, I mean, his last interview was like 97, but
Okay, so we don't know why he changes his statements, but that is a plausible or possible explanation, as
the real
is
truth is the doctor who said it treated him lied. That gives you ability to question anything in that case, in my opinion.
Okay, yeah. I mean, if that's what he says, then
Well, no, just
maybe.
you can Google that. That's on like all Washington Post, every single news article. Stephen Lynn's the guy's name,
I,
who said he did it for 30 years.
I mean, this. I think the thing with conspiracy theory is that
Don't
we
call it a
have.
conspiracy if it has evidence to back it up.
Okay, yeah, but that's my point, that we have evidence for all sorts of possible explanations, and then we make interpretive links between those bits of evidence. And that's where things start to become a bit shaky, isn't it? That they are the interpretive links we're making firm. And I think, with I mean, go back to Elvis, it's possible to make all sorts of kind of conspiratorial explanations of different things. And I did find a book once in talking of Elvis's growing library called Elvis and the Illuminati. And I thought, oh, this sounds really exciting, Elvis and the Illuminati. And I then checked it out on Amazon, and it was some like Wikipedia rehash. 50% of which was Elvis and 50% of which was about the Illuminati. This is bunk. So, I think there probably are things that are murky in the world of Elvis that we don't know about. But I don't know if we'll ever know about them. Um, and I think, yeah, uh, the thing with conspiracy theory is sometimes we put down a marker of what we think is an alternative explanation, which is very entertaining and commodifiable. Um, and then, we look for all sorts of circumstantial evidence to sort of make the trail or make the journey between what we know at present and what this explanation is. And I think that's where things, for me, start to get a little bit shaky because, like, from an academic sense, I can't really do that. I have to kind of go, well, every bit needs to be solid or I'll be challenged on it.
You just can't make the connections. You can't do that. If you just can only point out what is not right compared to what the official
Yeah.
thing was.
And there's that quote from Nietzsche, like, anything you look at for long enough becomes suspicious.
That's why like the JFK stuff for me, I don't even say who did it. I don't fight anybody. I don't fight Oswald's innocence. I said, but if you boil it down to things that you were told and to what we know now based on 60 years, it's a different picture. And I think at that point you can question. It's not saying who did it, it's not saying mob or anything like that, but there's just certain things that weren't, whether it was police failure, whether it was, I mean, the Dallas police was corrupt. I mean, they violated Oswald's rights, didn't let him speak to an attorney when he wanted to. They said he did it for fame. He's in interviews saying I'm a patsy. I don't know what that is, but there's a lot of just inconsistencies, and it's about not making the conclusion to it was this or it was this. I mean, we'll all have our independent theories, but when you see a document and then 50 something years later, a document gets released that counters that last one that was originally released, you just go, okay, something. But that's a fun topic for me. That's just something I'm just interested in. I'm not even going to ask your thoughts on it because I'm sure we'll end up getting into it.
I honestly don't know enough about JFK
That's
to give you any thoughts on it, but I was reading oh, what's the name of that guy? I was reading one book on it, and it was saying that somebody called a local newspaper in Cambridge, UK, before it happened and said something was about to happen.
yeah.
So I don't know whether that's true or not, but
It's though there's I think there's two people that did that, but one who's prominent from the UK that gets mentioned a lot is, oh, John Wilson, I think his name is. So there's this weird thing that happened with the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission had stated that Jack Ruby didn't have any mob connections or anything like that. Well, he did. The HSCA proved it later. They actually posted in their documents that, if you know what the HSCA is.
um,
It's the House Select Committee on Assassinations. It came about 10, 15 years later, but they proved probable conspiracy, but they kind of point at the mob, which only makes sense. You got Blakey in charge of it. I had Blakey on the show. He created RICO, which is the organized crime thing. So if you're talking about having a bias in your investigation, just get the guy from organized crime to end up with the conclusion of mob figures. Hey, whatever. But Bert Griffith, who is a lone nut, like believes Oswald did it. believes the Warren Commission did a great job. He did prove a fault in their investigation, and he served on the Warren Commission, not the primary committee. There's a secondary committee of all young lawyers. Arlen Specter was one. Um,
Sorry, I was going to say, I think what Elvis and the JFK story have in common is they seem to be endless places of sort of commodification and speculation, don't they? You know, people talk about
hey,
Elvis's life all the time and try and dig up new bits and angles and things, and they do the same for the JFK assassination. So I can
I mean,
see,
if you're hinting I'd doing that right now, I can tell you that the one thing we do know from Church Committee and all these investigations that came out in America was that Jack Ruby was in Havana when that British reporter said that there was
right,
he witnessed seeing Ruby in Havana, and when they asked Ruby it in questioning, he just said, "I was looking at the sites." Well, he visited Trafficante. Um, that can get called a conspiracy because nobody ever pursued leads. That's the issue, is that if you're trying to find answers, you have things that are either locked away, aren't there, or nobody did any damn police work.
so I can see why you would want to dig on the JFK story because you found a lot of things that don't match up the official narrative. Why do you want to dig on the Elvis story?
Just because I'm interested in a person whose music I listen to, I feel like you get a more appreciation to the actual thing you're listening to when you can understand the person who's singing it more than just a pretty face on a screen.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
yeah, totally. Yeah,
I'm not
totally.
a
And I
nut
think
job. Just got one topic that happens to paint me as one.
no, and I think understanding figures like Elvis might give you a sort of clue as to those times as well, you know, and maybe strategies for, you know, those questions around digging. There's a book called Elvis Decoded, which has loads of like moments in Elvis's life, a lot about when he died actually, which is kind of not surprising because that was one of the main tabloid focuses of Elvis. Um, and it just puts a lot of accounts alongside each other and goes, you know, well, these three match up and these don't. And so there is that sort of rabbit hole like nature of Elvis's life as well that people dig into.
Well, Mark, I know I went off on a tangent on JFK, but please, can everybody listen to where they can find your links at? You want to let them know Amazon, any other links you have, Twitter. I know you got website, Substack, anything.
Yeah, well, at the moment my website's down because I have a load of sorting out to do before I put it back up. But you can find me on Twitter as Sound Research, and you can find my various books on Amazon.
I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you again. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.